Good day, students. Today we shall be discussing about medieval Islamic historiography. Medieval Islamic historiography is a particular genre of historiography which emerged in West Asia from the 7th century onwards. And this particular way of looking at history, which came in with the advent of Islam, was a new element in the understanding of historical consciousness. So today we shall be looking at certain aspects of medieval Islamic historiography. Firstly, we would be looking at the importance of history within Islam and the way in which Islamic historians tried to frame historical opinions, historical perspectives. Secondly, we will also be looking at how the emergence of historical consciousness within Islam happened from the 7th century onwards and how it evolved over the course of the next 4 centuries till around the 10th and the 11th century. What were the main elements of medieval Islamic historiography? The Arabic and the Persian elements. And we shall also be looking at how the coming of Islam and Islamic historiography as a whole tried to change patterns of understanding of history in West Asia. So, if we move on, how did the Islamic historians try to define history from their own perspectives? Islam was a new religion in the 7th century, and they tried to look at the emergence not just of a new religion, but also of the new sense of historicity, the importance of knowledge or ilm within the understanding of Islam was very important to the creation of a historical consciousness. So the idea of ilm and history was actually named or termed as ilm-al-akbar or ilm-al-khabr, which is the history of events, history of times. There was also another term which was important from this period onwards, and which is that ilm-al-Tarikh. And ilm-al-Tarikh meant that a particular mandate, a particular era, a particular epoch of history was being spoken of. Therefore, the understanding of historicity and historical consciousness was present in Islam right from the very beginning. Franz Rosenthal, one of the essential proponents of Islamic historiography, in his book, A History of Muslim Historiography, considers that these two terms were extremely important for the understanding of historical consciousness within Islam. If we look at how Islamic historians understood historiography, then we would also understand how there were different shades of opinions which were given by these historians. For instance, we find that Ibn Khaldun in his Muqaddimah states that history refers to events that are peculiar to a particular age or race. So the idea that every culture, every religion would have its own notions of history was given importance. We find that al-Makrizi defined the object of historiography as giving information about what once took place in the world. So the idea that the past could be accessed by historians through the documents of the age was something which was present within Islam. We find that others, for instance, al-Kafiyaji, tried to understand historiography as a branch of learning, as a scientific way of understanding social science and history, which investigates time sections. So the element of time specificity and a region which was to be studied was there within Islam right from the very beginning. And we understand also that time and the consciousness that there could be different formats of time was also given importance by Islamic historians. In fact, time was considered as rectilinear and irreversible. So there was no cyclical concept of time within Islam, at least at the very beginning. So what are the sources of Islamic history? We understand that pre-Islamic Arabia was a collection of tribes, Bedouin tribes who inhabited the region, and they did not have any written histories at that time. But despite the fact that there were no written histories, we find that there were other forms of histories which were oral in nature. For instance, we find that ballads and poetic genres existed within Islam, or rather pre-Islamic Arabia, and these poetical genres were memorized, and they also could be understood by the people at that time through generations. So, the sources of history include the oral sources of Arabia. Pre-Islamic Arabia saw the rise of various genres of poetic editions, and these were transmitted orally across generations. There was another type of source which was there in Arabia, and these were the ilm-al, or the days of Arabia. And these referred to the battles, the feuds, and the internecine conflict between various tribes and the raids which were conducted by them. And these battle exegesis in terms of oral genres persisted in Arabia. There was another genre which came up with the advent of Islam, which is the Qur'ān and the Sunnah. So we find that the oral tradition and the reports which were given by various associates of Prophet Muhammad were also collated, and the revelations of Prophet Muhammad, which were enshrined in the Qur'an, became a very historical document. Not just a religious document, but also a historical document, because they showed how and where various revelations were received by Prophet Muhammad. There was another source of history within Islam, and which is that the customs and manners of Prophet Muhammad, the various sayings that he gave at various points of his life, were also collated, and this became the basis of the Hadith. And the Hadith is also a part of the historical understanding and evolution of Islam. We also find that there was another form of historiography in Islam, which is the understanding of genealogies. So, genealogies of tribes, genealogies of people and dynasties. This was also looked at by historians of this period. And there was a very important tradition which had grown up, which is the sequential transmission chains of information that is known as isnad within Islam. So any instance which was reported was actually quoted by later scholars, and these could be traced back to the person who was the eyewitness of that particular event. So the understanding that history and historical consciousness was inherent, it was there within Islam right from the very beginning. We also find that there were various biographies which were written about Prophet Muhammad. And these biographies, from the early times onward, the most authoritative of these biographies were written in around 767 AD, which is the life of the Prophet by Ibn Ishaq, who lived in Medina. And he was asked by Caliph Mansur to jot down this particular important biography. So biographical genre and the way in which biographies were important as historical resources were inherent within Islam from the very beginning. We also find two very important historians of this period. Al-Kalbis, they are known as Abu Nazar Muhammad bin Al-Kalbi, and his son Abul Mundhir Hisham bin Muhammad bin al-Kalbi. And these two, father and son duo, were also very important for the understanding of biographical genre in Islam right from the very beginning. They wrote in around the 763 and around 819. But where did this consciousness of historicity come within Islam? There is difference of opinion among historians as to where it originated. One view is by Franz Rosenthal, who considers that there was a direct impact of biblical and Jewish notions on the Islamic conceptions of history. There was another opinion which was given by Joseph Hell, who tried to show that it was the Persian civilization, especially the Sassanid Persian understanding of history, which created the beginning of historical consciousness within Islam. And there was also a third opinion which was given out, which is by Bertold Spuler, which is that Arabic historiography originated on its own, without any influence of either biblical or Jewish or Persian historiography. So, what were the features of Islamic historiography from the very beginning? We find that with the rapid spread of Islam across West Asia, into North Africa and into Europe as well, in Spain, the rapid spread of Islam obviously brought it in contact with different civilizations, the Greek, the Indian, and also the Roman civilizations. And this understanding of history obviously would have been influenced by some of these other civilizations as well, including the Persian. There was also an understanding of time, and this we can say that the idea of the new era, which is the Al-Hijri era, which began from around 622 AD onwards, was a particular time span which was adopted, a calendar which was adopted by Islamic historians, and religiosity was framed within the terms of a new time format. There was also the importance of Arabic language. Arabic language was not just the language of the Qur'an, but it also became the most important element or language component of historians. And Arabic historiography, which was based within Arabia, spread its wings and networks all across the Islamic civilization, into Persia and into West and North Africa as well. So the mode of preservation of the document of the Quran itself states that there was an authenticity, there was a particular way of understanding history, and there was a particular notion of textual authenticity. And this became the hallmark of the Islamic civilization. So the histories of earlier prophets who preceded Prophet Muhammad, the idea of new areas, new races being won over, conquered by Islam, and also the idea that Islam was bringing into focus a national spirit of Arabia was something which was very important for the understanding of historical consciousness during this period. Medieval historians obviously had a set format in their understanding of history. They were writing moral as well as religious forms of history, not just history for the sake of history. So that is why we find that history became so important for the Arabs. We find that history was looked at as a continuous process, and this continuity was important because it framed the revelation of religion and mankind as well. So Prophet Muhammad was looked at as an ideal person whose expectations were to be emulated by individuals. So Islamic rulers also wanted to understand how other rulers ruled in different territories so that they could themselves rule better. So this understanding of historicity was very important within Islam right from the very beginning. As we just mentioned, the silsila-e-isnad, or the chain of transmitters, is an important facet of Islamic historiography because we find that there was cross-checking. The hallmarks of historicity, which is the objectivity of a historian, the understanding of historical consciousness through cross-quotations from others, this was there right from the very beginning. That is why we find that Bernard Lewis, who has worked on Islamic historiography, states that interest in the past soon became a distinguishing characteristic of Muslim civilization. So, if we move on, how did Islamic historiography grow from the 7th century onward? We find that the classical period from around 750 onwards till around 1000 was a particular phase when there was a number of historical works which were created. We find that the Sirah, or the biographies of the Prophet being written, the Maghazi, or the books of wars and conquests being written, and we also find that ansab, or genealogies of various people being written at the same time. And finally, we have the Tabakat, or collection of biographies of different personalities being written. And all of this inculcated a historical sense within Islam. The important compendiums of or dictionaries of biographies which were written during this period, during the classical period from 750 onwards, included those by Baladuri, those by Yakuni, and by al-Tabari. And all of these were famed historians within Islam who tried to look at their own heritage, not just from a religious sense, but also from a universalist tone. So the history of Islam became almost a universal history for these scholars. The early writings of the Arabs in the 8th and the 9th century included a very scientific approach. So written sources and even unwritten sources were looked at with caution. They tried to look at the veracity, the authenticity of texts before they took it for granted. So the historical idea that history needs to be written on the basis of facts was there within Islam right from the very beginning. And during this period, we find a number of scholars like Ali bin Muhammad al-Madani, who left this world around 1840. He was a prolific writer who wrote over 100 books, and his analysis included a history of the caliphate, the history of particular places like Basra and Khorasan were written by Ali Madani. And we find that he was also a very important influence on others. For instance, Muhammad bin Omar al-Waqidi, who lived at Medina and in the early 9th century, Abd al-Hakam of Egypt, Ibn Sa'd in around the 9th century, and Ahmad bin Yahya al-Baladuri in Persia. All of these historians wrote in Arabic, and they belonged to a cosmopolitan world where the historical consciousness had already taken roots. So we find al-Waqidi's Kitab al-Maghazi, which discussed about the wars of Islam and how the conquests of Islam took place, not just within the borders of Arabia, but also far off. So we find others also like Ibn Sa'd and Ahmad bin Yahya al-Baladuri, who wrote his famous Fatahul Buldan. All of these belong to a genre of al-Maghazi material, which is war and conquest data. And this was significant to understand the spread of Islam, not just in the East, but also in the West, towards North Africa and into Europe. We find that apart from these writings, in the 10th century, there was a new form of historical consciousness which began to grow up among the Arab historians. And we find that the most famous historians of this period included Muhammad bin Jarir al-Tabari. And his most important work was Tarikh al-Rasul wal Muluk, which was also in short known as the Tarikh al-Tabari. The Tarikh al-Tabari was a phenomenal work within Islam because it tried to show how historical consciousness could be attained, how historical facts could be determined. And we find that this particular work was extremely chronological in nature. It dealt with a period from around 622 AD till around 915 AD. So the entire span of around 3 centuries was noticed in a very chronological, in a very substantiated and analytical manner by al-Tabari. So we find that al-Tabari had a major impact on historians of this period, and one of them was al-Masudi. Al-Masudi was a traveler, and his travels, which took place in different parts of the Indian Ocean, led him to understand geography and its importance for understanding the cultures of various other people. So we find that the travelogues which were being written, the sense of historicity coupled with geographic knowledge, became an important element of Islam from the 8th century onwards. So al-Masudi's personal observations in different parts of the globe was important for understanding the historicity of different places. In the 8th and the 9th and 10th centuries, we find that there were a large number of historical works which were written. And within this genre, there were a number of place histories, regional histories which were being written. Among them, we find that Abd al-Hakam's history of Egypt is one important element. There were also others within this genre, and regional histories became an important element for the understanding of Islamic civilization, and also place histories became important. So the history of Baghdad, for instance, which was the seat of the Abbasid dynasty from around 750 onwards till around 1258, we find that the compilation which was done by Ibn Abi Tahir Taifur was an important place history of Baghdad. The 10th century also saw different kinds of new elements coming in within Islamic historiography. One of them being that the new dynasties which came up across West Asia and in Central Asia, they began to write histories on the basis of the patronage which was given to historians who were professionally inducted by these dynasties. So the formation of new dynasties across West and Central Asia led to the emergence of a new professional class of historians. And within this genre, we find that there were several, like Ibn Hayyan al-Qurtubi, and even al-Biruni falls within this category. We find that the Arabic historians of the 11th century, for instance, the large number of historical writings which emerged in the 11th century, for instance, the Tariq al-Yamini by al-Utbi was an important particular narrative about the new dynasty at Ghazni. And Sabuktagin and his later followers, for example, Mahmud of Ghazni, were analyzed by al-Yamini or al-Utbi in a major manner. There were also other forms of historical writings during this period, and more we find that from the 10th and the 11th century onwards, the importance was not so much on religious history, but on political narratives. And these political narratives of Islam became very important. So new dynasties were formed. The Turkish influence within the eastern parts of Asia became important, and this was the phase when we find that different historians also cropped up. One of them, as we just mentioned, was al-Biruni, And also we find another person by the name of Ibn al-Asir, who wrote the Al-Kamil, that is also another historical work of this period. So the Turkish historians who wrote during this time, for instance, al-Biruni and his important work Kitabul Hind, was significant for his analysis of the Indian civilization. The most important impact about the philosophy of history within Arabic language was, however, in the 14th century by a person named Ibn Khaldun, and his Muqaddimah marks a new benchmark for the understanding of historical consciousness. We find that Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah is significant because of its philosophy of history. It tries to move beyond the theocentric approach, the religious approach which was taken by most historians earlier. And he tried to go beyond it. He tried to inculcate a new idea of causality, understanding causes and events connected with it. And he also tried to frame and look at how the caliphate had changed its nature from the very beginning down till the 11th and the 12th century. So, according to the Muqaddimah, Ibn Khaldun's approach was extremely objective. He didn't go in for the religious causes for the founding of empires, but he looked at the socio-political as well as the cultural reasons which were responsible for the growth and decline of empires. He also had a very dynamic conception of history, and this evolutionary dynamism which was present within Ibn Khaldun marked him out as a historian of repute. Ibn Khaldun's approach was also scientific, and he tried to inculcate a method of authenticating sources, accurate observation, as well as comparison and examination of data. So the Muqaddimah was an important element of historical consciousness within Islam. However, we find that there was also the growth of a Persian historiography within Islam from the 7th, 8th century onwards. The Persian historiography was more and more centered around the court. So courtly chronicles, and especially the understanding of history as an aristocratic element, that is, the understanding of history as an elite history, the history of nobles and kings, this originated only in Persia. The Arabic historiography was more generalized. It dealt with society, tribes, and nations. But Persian historiography was more and more centered around the court. And we find that al-Tabari's Tarikh, as also we find that various other writers became important influences for the Persian historians like Gardezi and Baihaqi. And these historians tried to look at the kings of this period also from a very notion of divinity. And this divinization of kings, the idea of sultans and their dynastic histories became important from within Persian historiography. We find that there was a particular genre of historiography which had originated, which is also known as adab literature. And these adab literature, how kings should rule, was also a particular genre which originated in Persia. We find Nizamul Mulk Tusi's Siyasatnama. We find Kaikaus's Kabusnama, the Nasihatul Mulk by Al-Ghazali, and there are so many others which tried to look at these kind of genres which were focused around the court and the inculcation of a dynastic history centered around kings. So, if we try to conclude, then we can understand that throughout the origin and evolution of Islam, there was a gradual understanding of historicity in various shades. Not all historiography within Islam was of the same nature. The Arabic historiography and the Persian historiography differed from each other. And it is the understanding of these new shades of historical consciousness which is important for us today. Thank you so much.